He woke before the city did. Not because he wanted to, not because mornings were peaceful or quiet or gentle. He woke because that was how life worked. For years, for decades, for as long as he could remember being an adult, the morning didn't belong to rest. It belonged to duty. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, feeling the weight of the day already pressing against his shoulders, not painfully, not angrily, just constantly. His house was simple, not poor, not luxurious, just honest. A house built from paychecks, not dreams. A house held together by routine, not luck. He made coffee the same way he always did. No fancy mugs, no quiet rituals of luxury. Just heat, just bitterness, just what kept a body moving. Because for most of his life, motion meant survival. Work meant purpose, and purpose lived in steel. He worked in a steel mill, not a small workshop, not a quiet factory. A mill, a place built out of metal, heat, pressure, noise, danger, rhythm, and human willpower. Where air never truly cooled, where walls never really rested, where every sound had weight, where every mistake had teeth. He didn't think of it as heroic. People far away sometimes spoke about steel as history, as economy, as politics, as something written in newspapers. Here, steel wasn't theory. It was reality. It was heat on skin. It was sweat in eyes. It was hours that stretched so long they didn't fit inside clocks. It was life. The mill wasn't just where he worked. It was where the world kept breathing. Мельница была не просто работой. Там продолжал дышать мир. When he was younger, he remembered staring at the furnaces for the first time. They didn't just glow. They burned. Alive. The fire wasn't decorative. It wasn't background. It demanded respect. It punished carelessness. It tested every man who stood near it. The heat pressed into skin. The roar buried itself in ears. The light stung eyes until water gathered. And still you had to keep looking. Still you had to keep working. He learned quickly. Steel doesn't forgive. It doesn't slow down for fear. It doesn't pause for uncertainty. It doesn't care who you are. You either learn to stand in its presence, or you leave. He stayed. He stayed through the years when his back was strong, and his hands could grip anything, and his lungs could swallow heat and dust. Without complaint, he stayed through nights when exhaustion crawled into his bones. But pride kept him upright. He stayed through storms, through winters that froze everything outside, and summers when the inside heat felt hotter than the sun itself. He stayed through laughter in break rooms, arguments about sports, stories repeated 1,000 times and still somehow worth hearing. He stayed because leaving never felt like an option. This was his work. This was his place. This was his purpose. And purpose, when you finally find it, wraps itself around your life. Not loudly, just completely. He never asked anyone to be impressed. He never called himself strong, though he was. He never called himself brave, though he had to be. Steel work wasn't something you bragged about. It was something you endured, something you carried, something that shaped muscle, bone, thought, sleep, silence, mood, patience, and pride. There are kinds of men the world doesn't celebrate loudly, but owes everything to. He was one of them. The years formed their own rhythm. Shift whistles, boots on concrete, metal on metal, voices shouting over roar and flame, machines groaning alive, furnaces breathing burning light. Tom didn't feel like numbers anymore. Tom felt like shifts, like days survived, like work finished. He came home tired, not dramatic tired, not collapsing tired, just deeply, permanently tired. He'd eat. He'd sit quietly, Sometimes he'd talk. Most times he wouldn't need to. Silence didn't mean emptiness. Silence meant everything had already been said with sweat. He slept not as a man resting, but as a body shutting down long enough to stand up again. And somehow, that was enough. His children grew up knowing the smell of steel and clothes, the faint burn scent in hair, the sound of boots by the door. They knew what late shift meant. They knew what double meant. They knew what it meant when he came home more tired than usual and sat down slower than normal. They loved him because he was steady. They respected him because they instinctively understood that this kind of work cost something. He wasn't rich. He never expected to be. But his kids, they ate. They slept warm. They had a home. They had a father who never broke. That was wealth enough. And the city lived on steel. It wasn't just jobs. It was rhythm. It was identity. It was meaning. Shops survived because men worked. Schools stayed alive because families stayed. Church pews filled because nobody had to leave. Restaurants stayed open. Streets stayed busy. Houses stayed bright at night. Everything burned warm because the furnaces burned hot. Steel built more than buildings. It built lives. Сталь строила не только здания. Она строила жизни. And somewhere along the way, everyone convinced themselves of a dangerous idea. This will last forever. How could it not? How could something this big, this loud, this powerful, ever disappear? Fire doesn't just stop. Cities don't simply go quiet. Work doesn't just vanish. At least, that's what people told themselves. Until they began to notice things don't collapse instantly. They fade. The first signs of change were quiet. They almost always are. A rumor here, a whisper there, a story about another town's mill. A headline read quickly and dismissed. Meetings, new management, different schedules, strange words people didn't like hearing. Cost reduction, outsourcing, global competition, inefficiency, cutbacks. No one panicked at first. Why would they? The furnaces were still burning. Smoke still rose into sky. Trucks still came and went. People still clocked in. Noise still thundered through metal and bone. Life still moved. But beneath the familiar roar, something felt unsteady, like a tremor hiding inside a giant, like a heartbeat not quite matching its usual rhythm. He noticed it. He didn't talk about it. Talking makes fears heavier, but he felt it, and he didn't like what it meant. And then, slowly, things began to shift. Not dramatically, not instantly, just enough to unsettle the ground beneath familiar steps. Schedules tightened. Positions disappeared. Sections closed temporarily. Temporary things have a way of becoming permanent. There was more silence in places that used to roar. More stillness in areas that once swarmed with life. He walked through parts of the mill that looked like time had paused mid-movement. Tools waiting for hands that wouldn't return. Machines standing still with purpose drained out of them. Dust where there never used to be dust. That was the moment he understood. Something alive was beginning to die. And then one morning, they were called together. No roaring machines. No ferni sander. Just men. Men who had built their lives with heat and strength. Standing still, in a place that never believed stillness was possible. Management spoke. They used words that sounded rehearsed, carefully chosen, emotionally distant, corporate, words that didn't belong in a place like this, words that didn't understand what this place meant. They talked about market pressures, economic realities, global shifts, operational restructuring. But what those words really meant was simple. The mill was shutting down, not for a week, not for repairs, not for adjustment, shutting down permanently. The furnaces would go cold. The machines would fall silent. And something that felt immortal would end. There was no dramatic shouting, no chows, no smashing equipment, just quiet. A quiet so heavy it almost had weight. Men who spent years shouting over roaring fire suddenly could barely speak. One dropped his shoulders. One stared at the floor. One swallowed hard and nodded slowly, as if he nodded enough times, maybe his heart would eventually accept the idea. He stood too, still, heavy, older somehow than he had been 10 minutes before. He didn't cry, not because he didn't want to, but because men like him had been taught their entire lives to carry pain in their chest and keep walking. But inside, a lifetime shifted. He walked through the mill one last time, not as a worker, as someone saying goodbye to something that had raised him. He touched a railing he had leaned on thousands of times. He ran his fingers across metal worn smooth by years of use. He looked at the furnaces, and for the first time, they weren't alive. They were just objects, cold now, silent, empty. He realized something deeply painful. The world had decided it didn't need this place anymore. And when the world stops needing a place, it stops needing the people shaped by it too. The furnaces didn't just burn steel. They forged lives. Печи плавили не только сталь. Они ковали жизни. And now they were gone. He went home that day without clocking out. You don't clock out of something like that. You just leave, carrying everything with you. He walked in quieter than usual. His house felt different, not changed physically, just changed in meaning. Before, it was the place you returned to after work. Now, it was just a place. No shift waiting, no furnace calling, no rhythm guiding the next day. Just time, and too much of it. Days started to stretch. At first, people pretended to be fine. They fixed things around their houses. They joked. They talked about temporary problems and new beginnings. But reality isn't fooled easily. It comes slowly, like fog that thickens until suddenly you realize you can't see anything ahead anymore. Shops started closing. Restaurants lost regulars. Families moved. For sale signs appeared quietly on lawns. Some people found other work. Some didn't. Some pretended they didn't miss the mill at all. Some missed it so much it hurt to breathe. He didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't bring fire back. He just lived. Slower, quieter, heavier. There were mornings when he still woke before dawn. Years of habit don't disappear just because a furnace does. He would sit at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around coffee, not because he needed to stay awake, but because he needed to hold something. He'd listen to a silence that didn't feel peaceful, silence that wasn't restful, silence that wasn't earned, just silence where once there had been meaning. Work doesn't just pay bills. Sometimes it holds your life together. Работа не просто оплачивает счета. Иногда она держит твою жизнь вместе. And when it leaves, everything shifts. He went by the mill sometimes. Not every day, just when memory needed proof that it had all actually happened. The gate stayed locked. Grass grew where footsteps used to erase it. Wind traveled through places that once belonged to heat. He stood there, hands in pockets, older, quieter, trying to understand how something so powerful could disappear so completely. There was no fire now, no sander, no shaking ground, only stillness. A place once louder than life, now quieter than a whisper. Years passed. People stopped talking about the mill. New towns forgot it existed. Economists might mention it in a sentence. History might note it in a paragraph. But life isn't lived in paragraphs. It's lived in the space between alarm clocks and dinner tables. between hope and exhaustion, between who you were supposed to become and who life allowed you to be. He didn't become famous. He didn't become rich. He didn't change the world, but he held it up for decades with his back, with his hands, with his lungs, with his strength, with his patience, with his quiet dignity. And when the fires went out and the city faded and the world moved on, his life still mattered deeply. One evening, late in his life, someone asked him, "Do you ever wish you had done something different?" He thought for a moment. He didn't rush the answer. He thought about the heat, the danger, the exhaustion, the pride, the friendships, the rhythm, the purpose. He thought about raising a family, feeding people he loved, keeping a home warm, being part of something bigger than himself. And he simply said, "I worked hard. I stood my ground. I did what needed to be done. That was enough." And it was because ordinary lives aren't ordinary at all. They hold everything: work, identity, community, love, sacrifice, time, and then, eventually, memory. Before we forgot,